Classic car fuel economy. We did a video a couple of weeks ago saying that we were going to start looking into this because of the price of fuel and scarcity and whatnot. So before I think we can really get into the nuts and bolts of getting better fuel economy from any particular carbureted traditional engine, we kind of have to look at the extremes first, because there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of different trains of thought that kind of like get in the way. And there are three that I think we should talk about because they're the most common. And the first is one that goes back probably 50 years, 60 years. And that's the myth of the 100, 200, 500 mile per gallon carburetor. Everybody's heard the story. Some inventor in Ohio or Iowa, whatever, on the farm, comes up with this idea for the carburetor that's got to get 100, 200 miles to the gallon, and he goes and he has the whole thing made up and patented and so on and so forth. And then one day, a black helicopter with two guys in black suits show up at his door, and he's never seen or heard from again, and the secret goes missing. The problem with that particular scenario, with that idea, is that it's based on the premise that the carburetor controls the fuel demand of the engine. Which, you would think, all right, it's because you step on the gas and the carburetor is the first link in the chain, that it dictates what the engine is going to do. But that's not the case. All you're doing is, when you put your foot on the gas, is you're adding air. You're not adding fuel. The fuel demand of the engine is metered through the carburetor, but it's determined by the demand of the engine itself. Primarily, you've got a cylinder that displaces X amount of space, and it's going to require X amount of fuel and air to create the optimum mixture for the optimum combustion at any given point in its cycle. That's a mouthful. The carburetor is not determining how much fuel the engine needs. The carburetor is delivering the fuel that the engine asks for, and it does it through metering devices. So on a typical carburetor, you've got several metering devices. There's the accelerator pump, which adds a little extra squirt of fuel when vacuum falls off and the engine vacuum can't pull adequately through the other systems. You've got the choke, which is an enriching device that basically cuts off the amount of air to create a default rich situation, and that's just for when it's cold. And modern fuel-injected engines use the same system, but they use, instead of having a choke to cut off the amount of air, they use the coolant temp sensor to enrich the mixture and create the same situation. So if the engine is cold, it gets the air that it needs. You've got the idle circuits, which don't change. You can't do anything to an idle circuit to improve economy. The idle circuit is as lean as it has to be, is set as lean as it has to be to maintain a smooth idle. Nothing you can do there. The only place where you can actually make a change is in the part throttle metering. And the part throttle metering, so Holley's use a system all their own, but most production engines, like this is the top of an Edelbrock, which is the same as an AFB or an AVS, most production engines use the metering rod system. And it's basically this. This is a plunger and a spring assembly. So the spring is in here to hold the plunger up. This is activated by engine vacuum. When the motor is, let's say, idling, small throttle opening, vacuum is high, and this is pulled all the way down. When this is pulled down, you see this metering rod right here. It has a step. It's narrow here and it's thick here. When vacuum is high, smaller throttle opening, vacuum is high, this is pulled all the way down, and the fat part of the metering rod partially blocks off the jet. When you give it gas, vacuum falls off, the spring pulls up on the plunger, and you go into this thinner part of the jet, which allows more gas to go in. So simply put, like to put it in its most basic form, at high vacuum situations, this is all the way down and the engine is lean. At low vacuum situations, like when you step on the gas, this pops up and the engine goes fat. And in between, this spring allows this thing to basically oscillate and cycle between rich and lean. And that's the fuel metering device. believe it or not, they're as precise as they can be. It's a vacuum-operated computer based on direct demand. The premise that you can get 100 miles to the gallon, 200 miles to the gallon out of a carburetor assumes that the carburetor just willy-nilly throws gas around like it has no purpose or being. But in actuality, the carburetor, assuming it's tuned correctly and it's matched correctly to the engine that it's running, the carburetor is giving the engine specifically what the engine is asking for. So the carburetor doesn't control how much fuel the motor is going to use. The motor controls how much fuel it's going to ask for, and it does it through these various vacuum-operated systems. So that's that. There is no such thing as 100, 200, 600, 1,000 mile per gallon carburetor. It is a myth. As we sit here right now, around the world, and for the last 100 years, some of the most brilliant minds that ever existed have focused on the carburetor and maximizing the carburetor's efficiency and ability to do the kind of work that you're asking it to do. These guys haven't come up with anything. The farmer in Iowa tinkering with his tractor isn't going to come up with anything better than that. The carburetor is actually an extremely efficient, extremely responsive mechanical computer. They work. Now you talk about brilliant minds, and we're going to get to that in a minute because we're going to talk about the hot vapor motor, the Smokey unit hot vapor motor. But before we do that, we have to talk about these engines that run on vapors. Now if you do a search, you'll see that there's a bunch of videos, people playing around with vapor run engines. And it's it'll usually be a lawnmower or a static motor, something that's just running. And what they'll do is they'll have a separate fuel supply. There's no carburetor. They'll have a separate fuel supply, like a jug or a glass jar with gasoline in it, and they'll run from the intake manifold of the carburetor. They'll run a line that goes to the top of this canister, and then there's a way to pull air from the atmosphere through the gas. So what's happening now is as the engine is running, the vacuum is pulling air into this chamber, it's aerating the fuel, and the vapor from that is being drawn into the engine, and the engine runs on that. And you'll see that it works, and there's no reason it wouldn't work. The problem with it is that it'll only work at a steady state. There are no enrichment circuits or anything like that to help modulate the mixture of gas, the amount of gas that's going into the engine. So basically it's just whatever the vapor can pick up at any given. So basically you wouldn't have any accelerator pump, you wouldn't have any type of enrichment circuits. So it's not a practical thing to use on an engine that goes through the cycles like an automobile engine or a motorcycle. It can't compensate for fuel demand and tailor it. It can only pull that X amount of fuel through whatever the vacuum created by the engine is going to pull. So that's a dead end. And what isn't a dead end is the Smokey unit hot vapor engine. And this is something I've looked at for many years to try to see like how this can be worked in a practical application. And Smokey unit tried. The guy was brilliant. And he built several running prototypes. He built one for Chrysler, he built one for General Motors. The idea works, it functions. The problem, well, we'll talk about the problems in a minute. The hot vapor engine, also known as an adiabatic engine. Adiabatic meaning that the heat is in a closed source, is in a closed circuit, I should say. The adiabatic engine works on this principle. Have you ever lit a barbecue? Now picture this now, right? You're going to light a barbecue. So you lay your coals out, and you put the lighter fluid, you sprinkle the lighter fluid over it, and you throw a match, and it lights, and the fluid burns slowly, and it starts to light the coals. But it doesn't really do such a hot job, right? You've only got little bits of coal lit. So you take the lighter fluid, and you splash it down on there again, and now you've got these vapors coming off of it. You've got, steam. You've got fuel steam coming off of the coals. Now, when you take a match and you go to light it, that thing doesn't just go poof, it goes poof, right? Because the heat lightened up the fuel so much, it spread those molecules apart so far that ignition is almost spontaneous. You get this woof. That's the principle that the hot air the hot vapor engine works on. So what Smokey did was he added systems to the external part of the engine. This is still a carbureted engine. He added systems to the external bits of the intake tract to create a superheated intake runner. What he did was he ran the exhaust through passages surrounding the intake runners to bring the intake, the temperature of the intake runner up to around 450 to 500 degrees, which is the opposite of what we think of right away. We want to lower the intake temperature to increase the density of the fuel, get more oxygen in there, and have a bigger bang. What Smokey was going for was the more volatile mixture of a lighter fuel mixture, a more volatile reaction to a lighter fuel mixture. So by heating the intake tract to around 450 degrees Fahrenheit, by surrounding it with an exhaust jacket, using the exhaust from the engine to heat this, it would lighten up that fuel charge enough so that when it did get into the combustion chamber and was hit by the spark plug, bam, instant power. In concept, it works. But you have a couple of hurdles you have to cross here. The first is that by raising the intake temperature that high, you're creating a high pressure area in the intake runner. So it's not going to want to pull fuel easily through the carburetor, to actually pull the fuel through the jets, the metering devices, and get it into the engine. So in order to make this happen, you have to turbocharge it. The turbocharger isn't there to create power. The turbo is there to maintain positive pressure under the carburetor to make sure that the fuel gets pulled through and run. There has to be a couple of stages to heating this. You can't just go from dead atmospheric temperature to 450 degrees in one shot without it having a negative effect on the quality of atomization of the fuel. So it has to have a preheating chamber. And then a preheated chamber consisted of a water system. So basically you had the carburetor, you had a draw-through, you had the carburetor, you had a plenum underneath it that was heated by water, the engine's coolant system, so that was like a preheater. Then you had the turbocharger, and after the turbocharger, you had the exhaust jacketed intake runners, and that's where all of the superheating would take place. So he, like I said, he built several running prototypes. The concept works. It does make power. There is a 20-25% increase in fuel mileage doing it this way. The problem you run into, you have two problems with this. And the first is extreme complexity. There are so many things going on, so many different systems at work, that it's not practical to use like you're not just going to whip up a hot vapor engine and make this thing go. There's a lot of plumbing. There's a lot of factors that have to be considered here, and there's a lot of failure points, which is one of the reasons that for mass production, it just wasn't the way to go. The other problem is that the engine operates optimally in a steady state. But when you get to the point, let's say you've got this engine running, you run into the store, you shut it off, it sits for 10 or 15 minutes. When you go to restart it, the calibrations of everything are way wrong. So it's not an engine that's instantly like just turn the key and go. There are factors, there are warming factors and cooling factors and everything else that have to be taken into consideration. So metering, the fuel metering demands aren't consistent. There were drawbacks to it, but the system, the basic idea, it does work. Probably with today's technology, with the way that ignition timing can be controlled, the way fuel injection has a more precise way to deliver fuel, yeah, there's a possibility that maybe that needs to be rethought. But that, in essence, in a nutshell, is the Smokey Unique hot vapor engine. There is one other concept for extreme mileage, the 5-cycle engine, but we'll talk about that in another video because that's something that's being explored right now. We'll talk about that in another video. It doesn't really fit this one. because there's no way to apply it to a classic car or to a traditional type of engine. So that's basically the nutshell. That's your extreme fuel mileage examples. They don't apply in the real world. They don't apply in the practical world that we're going to talk about. So the next step with this is we're going to go through taking a typical traditional muscle car, classic car, vintage car, and we'll start to go through some of the systems and how to optimize those systems in the name of fuel economy. I hope you got something out of that. I covered a lot of ground, right? I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.